At 4:32 a.m. on February 23, 1945, the island of Iwo Jima was silent in a way that only battlefields become after weeks of violence. The wind had stopped. The naval guns had paused. Even the sporadic crack of rifle fire along the southern slopes of Mount Suribachi faded into the background. For the first time in days, the surface of the island seemed almost calm. 30 feet below that surface, inside a reinforced concrete bunker cut directly into volcanic rock, Japanese soldiers sat motionless in the dark. The bunker was not improvised. It had been surveyed, measured, and engineered months earlier. Its walls were nearly 1 meter thick. Steel beams reinforced the ceiling. The floor sloped slightly to allow drainage in case of flooding. A narrow ventilation shaft, angled twice before reaching the surface, allowed air to circulate while preventing blast pressure from traveling downward. By Japanese defensive doctrine, this position was ideal. Above them, American forces had already unleashed one of the most intense bombardments in naval history. Over 6 consecutive days, U.S. battleships, cruisers, and destroyers had fired more than 16,000 tons of high-explosive shells onto an island barely 8 square miles in size. Individual battleship shells weighed up to 2,700 pounds. Some struck with enough force to leave craters 40 feet wide. Yet inside the bunker, the structure held. Dust fell from the ceiling during direct hits. The ground shook, ears rang. But the concrete did not crack. The beams did not bend. The tunnel network remained intact. From the perspective of the men underground, this was proof that the system worked. Japanese planners had learned from earlier defeats in the Pacific. On islands like Tarawa and Kwajalein, surface defenses had been obliterated by American firepower before infantry even landed. Iwo Jima was different. Here, the defense was not meant to stop the invasion at the beach. It was meant to survive it. By early 1945, Japanese engineers had carved more than 11 miles of interconnected tunnels beneath Iwo Jima. These tunnels linked bunkers, pillboxes, artillery positions, command posts, and ammunition chambers. Entire companies could move unseen from one side of the island to the other without ever surfacing. Depth was the shield. Patience was the weapon. Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, the island's commander, had forbidden banzai charges. He ordered his men to stay hidden, to let the Americans advance, and to kill them slowly from prepared positions. Every bunker was designed to be abandoned temporarily and reoccupied later. Nothing was meant to be defended to the last man. Survival meant resistance. Inside the bunker that morning, the soldiers believed they were executing that plan perfectly. They had already endured nearly a week of bombardment. They had watched American Marines advance cautiously, yard by yard, paying for every ridge and crater in blood. They had opened fire, withdrawn, repositioned, and fired again. Each time, they slipped back underground before American fire could destroy them. American artillery could flatten the surface, naval guns could pulverize beaches, aircraft could strafe and bomb, but none of it reached 30 feet below volcanic rock. To the men in the bunker, the conclusion was obvious. America's greatest strength had limits. At approximately 4:40 a.m., muffled movement became audible near the bunker's firing slit. The sound was familiar. American infantry probing forward. Boots in sand, equipment shifting, low voices. This was not unusual. By that point in the battle, the bunker's defenders had already repelled multiple attempts to neutralize their position. Rifle fire had been ineffective. Grenades thrown into the entrance had detonated harmlessly in the angled corridor. A satchel charge placed near the opening had collapsed some loose rock, but failed to breach the main chamber. Each failed attempt reinforced the same belief. The bunker was too strong to be taken directly. Inside, the air was warm but breathable. Ammunition was stacked neatly along the walls. Weapons were cleaned and ready. Water was rationed carefully. The men waited. They did not fire when the footsteps stopped. They did not fire when the noise outside faded completely. Instead, they waited for the next artillery strike, the next explosion, the next predictable attempt to break the bunker from the outside. None came. What the men underground did not know was that American units moving through Iwo Jima were adapting rapidly. Marine assault teams were learning that destroying bunkers outright consumed enormous time and casualties. Each bunker could cost dozens of lives if attacked conventionally. So American doctrine shifted. Rather than collapsing bunkers, Marines began focusing on making them unusable. At less than 40 feet from the firing slit, an American Marine knelt behind cover, steadying a weapon that weighed just over 70 pounds when fully loaded. 2 cylindrical tanks were strapped to his back. A hose extended from the tanks to a nozzle fitted with an ignition system. The effective range of the weapon was short, barely 40 yards. In open terrain, it was vulnerable. The operator was exposed, the fuel supply limited. But inside tunnels, range was irrelevant. The fuel burned at temperatures exceeding 1600 degrees Fahrenheit. Once ignited, it did not explode outward like a grenade or shell. It behaved like a liquid, flowing along surfaces, climbing walls, spreading across ceilings, and following air currents deep into confined spaces. It did not need to hit a target directly. It only needed an opening. Inside the bunker, the first sign of danger was not noise or light, it was heat. The temperature began to rise rapidly, far faster than any previous bombardment had caused. Within seconds, the air thickened. Oxygen was consumed. Breathing became difficult. Smoke pressed into the chamber, rolling along the ceiling before sinking downward. The bunker that had resisted thousands of pounds of explosives suddenly behaved like a sealed container. The men realized too late that the Americans were no longer trying to destroy the bunker. They were trying to empty it. In the system Japanese engineers had built, depth had been protection against force. But now that same depth trapped heat, smoke, and fire with nowhere to escape. For the first time since the invasion began, the safest place on the island was becoming the most dangerous. And underground, Japanese defenders understood that something fundamentally new had entered the battlefield. At 4:41 a.m., the bunker was no longer silent. It was choking. Inside the chamber, the temperature climbed with terrifying speed. Not gradually, not like heat from artillery blasts that passed overhead. This was different. This heat stayed. It pressed inward, wrapping around bodies, crawling along the walls, sinking into lungs. Men dropped instinctively to the floor, where the air was supposed to be cooler. It wasn't. The bunker's ventilation shaft, angled to block blast waves, now worked against them. Instead of clearing smoke, it created a pressure imbalance. Hot air surged inward faster than it could escape. Oxygen thinned. Every breath became shorter than the last. Within seconds, eyes burned, throats tightened, speech became impossible. This was not a weapon the Japanese defensive doctrine had prepared them for. Japanese bunker designs were built to survive concussive force. Shock waves dissipated against angled corridors. Reinforced doors absorbed shrapnel. Concrete stopped fragments and pressure. The tunnels had endured weeks of shelling because explosions were momentary. Fire was not. Outside, the American Marine operating the flamethrower adjusted his stance. He had trained for this, but training never replicated the reality. The weapon's ignition system hissed softly. A squeeze of the trigger sent a stream of thickened fuel forward, igniting instantly as it left the nozzle. The flame did not roar like in movies. It flowed. The burning fuel splashed against the bunker's firing slit and poured inward, breaking into smaller streams as it struck rock and steel. Inside, it followed gravity, walls, air currents. Flames climbed along surfaces, spreading laterally, pooling where the floor dipped. The heat spike was immediate and lethal. Temperatures inside confined spaces hit levels far beyond survivability. At over 1,200 degrees Fahrenheit, exposed skin burned in seconds. At lower temperatures, oxygen depletion killed just as efficiently. Smoke inhalation rendered men unconscious in under a minute. Those who tried to retreat deeper into the tunnel system found no escape. The interconnected design that once allowed movement now functioned like a network of ducts, channeling heat and smoke farther inward. One bunker ignited another. A system designed for endurance became a closed furnace. By 4:43 a.m., resistance from that position had ceased entirely. Outside, American Marines did not rush the entrance. They waited. Experience had taught them that fire took time to finish its work. Any man who emerged afterward was usually disoriented, burned, or suffocating. Often, no one emerged at all. Across Iwo Jima, this pattern repeated itself dozens of times that morning. American assault units had been issued flamethrowers in unprecedented numbers. By February 1945, Marine divisions landing on the island carried more flamethrowers than any previous force in U.S. military history. Roughly one flamethrower was assigned for every 100 yards of front-line advance. This was not improvisation, it was policy. Commanders had analyzed casualty reports from earlier island battles. Conventional bunker clearing methods resulted in unacceptable losses. Grenades failed, rifle fire was useless. Satchel charges required close contact and often killed the Marines using them. Flamethrowers reduced a bunker in seconds, not by destroying it, by making it uninhabitable. Japanese soldiers began to understand this shift almost immediately. Survivors retreating through tunnels carried the message faster than any order could. Bunkers that had survived days of bombardment were falling silent within minutes once the Americans reached them. The realization spread unevenly but relentlessly. Depth no longer meant safety. In one tunnel complex near Airfield No. 2, a Japanese platoon commander ordered his men to seal internal blast doors to contain the fire. The doors held, the fire did not pass through. The smoke did. Carbon monoxide seeped through seams, hinges, and cracks. Men collapsed where they stood. The doors reopened hours later to find bodies untouched by flame, faces frozen mid-breath. American after-action reports recorded this with clinical detachment. Position neutralized, enemy resistance ceased, bunker cleared. But Japanese accounts tell a different story. Private First Class Masao Iwata wrote in his diary, later recovered from his remains, "The fire does not end. The walls sweat heat. The air kills faster than bullets." By midday, entire sections of the Japanese defensive network were silent. What shocked American commanders was not how quickly positions fell, but how thoroughly. Bunkers, once thought capable of holding out for weeks, were being eliminated permanently. There was no counterattack from below, no reoccupation, no second phase. The tunnels still existed, but they were empty. This created a new operational reality. For the first time in the Pacific War, American infantry could advance without expecting previously cleared positions to reawaken behind them. The battlefield was becoming linear rather than circular. Progress stayed permanent. Japanese defenders, trained to fight a war of attrition from concealment, were being stripped of their advantage. By February 23rd's afternoon, U.S. Marine units reported a measurable drop in enemy fire from underground positions, not because Japanese morale had collapsed, but because the environment that sustained resistance no longer existed. And for Japanese soldiers still underground, the fear was no longer of artillery or tanks. It was of silence. Silence meant the Americans were close. Silence meant they had time. Silence meant they were bringing the weapon that turned shelter into a trap. That night, inside tunnels that had once felt invulnerable, men waited without sleeping. Every sound echoed. Every vibration raised panic. No one knew which bunker would be next. Above them, American Marines prepared fuel tanks, checked ignition systems, and marked bunker entrances on maps. The war beneath Iwo Jima was no longer about holding ground. It was about how long you could breathe. February 21st, 1945, Iwo Jima. Subterranean Command Sector, Mount Suribachi Perimeter. Lieutenant Colonel Takechi Nishi stood inside a reinforced operations chamber carved 12 meters below volcanic rock. The bunker had survived naval bombardment, aerial bombing, and 3 days of continuous artillery fire. Its walls were intact. Its communications lines still functioned. Its maps were precise. Yet every red marker on the board told the same story. Silence. Entire defensive nodes had gone dark. Not overrun, not contested. Gone. Japanese defensive doctrine on Iwo Jima had been engineered around depth. More than 11 miles of tunnels connected pillboxes, artillery chambers, ammunition vaults, and troop shelters. Some corridors extended 20 meters underground. Others descended over 25 meters, reinforced with steel doors, zigzag turns, and pressure baffles. This system had taken over 18 months to construct. It was designed to nullify American advantages in firepower. And it had worked, at least at first. Naval guns flattened the surface, but failed to destroy the underground. Bombs collapsed entrances, only for defenders to reopen them from inside. Artillery chewed the island daily, yet Japanese casualties remained far below American estimates. On paper, the plan was functioning. But the numbers coming in told a different story. By the morning of February 21st, Japanese commanders estimated that over 60% of frontline bunker positions had ceased firing entirely. Reconnaissance patrols reported no movement, no counterattacks, no reoccupation attempts. This was unprecedented. In previous battles, American units cleared the same bunker multiple times. Defenders emerged from tunnels after nightfall. Positions thought destroyed reopened fire days later. Here, once a bunker went silent, it stayed silent. The cause was not collapse. It was abandonment by death. American flamethrower usage statistics revealed a pattern clearly. During the first 4 days of fighting, Marine units expended over 9,500 gallons of napalm-thickened fuel specifically for bunker neutralization. Each flamethrower carried roughly 4 gallons per tank. That meant thousands of individual ignition events across the island. Each one sealed a space permanently. Japanese medical officers reported something they had never documented before: entire tunnel sections filled with bodies that showed no visible trauma, no shrapnel wounds, no gunshots. Men frozen where they stood, lungs destroyed by heat and oxygen deprivation. Death without combat. The psychological impact spread faster than the fire. Survivors retreating deeper carried the knowledge with them. A bunker did not need to be breached. It only needed to be reached. Once Americans identified an opening, depth became irrelevant. The realization was devastating. Japanese countermeasures were discussed. Internal blast doors, water barriers, emergency ventilation rerouting. None worked. Fire did not need to pass through doors. Smoke did. Heat did. Pressure did. Some commanders ordered bunkers sealed preemptively, hoping to isolate flames. Those bunkers became tombs when oxygen ran out. Others attempted evacuation protocols, but movement through tunnels exposed troops to secondary ignition as Americans systematically sealed exits. The Americans had adapted their tactics with brutal efficiency. Flamethrower teams operated alongside riflemen, engineers, and demolition crews. One unit would locate firing slits, another would suppress. The flamethrower advanced. Engineers followed to seal entrances with explosives or collapsed rock. Once cleared, the position was marked and bypassed. No return. By February 22nd, Marine Corps intelligence concluded that Japanese underground resistance had lost cohesion. The network still existed physically, but functionally it was dead. Command and control collapsed as units disappeared without communication. Japanese officers began to grasp a terrifying equation. Every bunker destroyed reduced future resistance permanently. Every gallon of fuel erased weeks of preparation. Every American advance stayed. This was not attrition, it was erasure. Comparisons became unavoidable. Japanese engineers had calculated that their tunnel systems could survive months of bombardment. They had not accounted for sustained fire within confined spaces. The Americans had brought a weapon that converted protection into vulnerability, and they had brought it in quantity. By the end of February, U.S. forces had deployed over 1,000 flamethrowers on Iwo Jima, including infantry-carried units and vehicle-mounted systems. Shermans modified with E-45 auxiliary flamethrowers projected burning fuel over 150 yards, sealing cave mouths without exposing infantry. One tank could neutralize a complex that had resisted battalions. Japanese observers reported seeing entire ridge lines fall silent after a single armored flamethrower engagement. This created a strategic collapse that numbers alone could not reverse. Japanese doctrine relied on trading space for time. Every bunker was supposed to delay the enemy, bleed him, and force costly assaults. But fire ignored time. Once applied, it ended the fight immediately. American casualty rates reflected this shift. In sectors where flamethrowers were used extensively, Marine losses dropped sharply after initial contact, not because resistance weakened, but because it ended. Japanese casualties, meanwhile, spiked catastrophically. By February 25th, estimates suggested that tens of thousands of defenders remained underground. Yet organized resistance dwindled daily. Many were alive but trapped. Others suffocated in sealed tunnels. Some refused to leave, convinced death above ground would be worse. Officers received fragmented reports of men choosing suicide rather than waiting. The underground, once a sanctuary, had become a place of anticipation, waiting for heat, waiting for smoke, waiting for the moment the Americans found their entrance. In the operations chamber, Colonel Nishi reviewed the remaining options. None involved recovery, only delay, only endurance measured in hours, not weeks. The Americans were not dismantling the Japanese defense. They were rendering it obsolete. And beneath Iwo Jima, the realization settled like ash. This was not a battle for the island. It was a lesson in modern warfare. Shelter no longer protected. Depth no longer mattered. And for the first time, the Japanese defenders understood something too late. The Americans had found a way to fight underground without going underground themselves. February 24th, 1945. Iwo Jima. Northern Tunnel Network, Hill 382. By this point in the battle, Japanese resistance had not ended, it had transformed. Gunfire still erupted from hidden apertures. Mortars still fired from concealed chambers. Snipers still appeared where no living man should have been able to survive. On the surface, the island looked active, contested, unfinished. Underground, it was something else entirely. Japanese soldiers began to describe the tunnels using a new word in their reports: netsu, heat. Not from explosions, but from presence. A creeping, suffocating warmth that lingered long after the Americans had moved on. Medical logs recovered after the battle tell the story clearly. Units reported rising cases of unconsciousness, respiratory failure, and delirium in tunnel sections that had not been directly attacked. Ventilation systems, once adequate, became liabilities. Smoke traveled farther than fire. Heat moved through rock. Entire sections of the tunnel network became uninhabitable without ever being entered by American troops. This was the moment Japanese commanders fully understood the asymmetry. American forces did not need to clear the tunnels. They only needed to contaminate them. U.S. Marine after-action reports show a deliberate shift in doctrine during this phase of the battle. Flamethrowers were no longer used reactively against active firing points. They were used preemptively against suspected entrances, vents, and secondary exits. Engineers mapped airflow patterns. Where smoke traveled, fire would follow. Between February 23rd and March 1st, Marine units sealed or neutralized an estimated 70% of all known tunnel access points in the northern half of the island. Many of these were not combat positions, but logistics corridors, medical chambers, or command routes. The result was isolation. Japanese defensive design assumed movement. Units were supposed to rotate between positions, counterattack at night, reoccupy cleared bunkers, and reinforce weak sectors. This required tunnels to remain breathable. Once airflow failed, doctrine failed with it. Survivor testimony recorded after the war reveals the psychological fracture this caused. Soldiers described hearing American flamethrowers days before they were used on their own position. The sound alone was enough to trigger panic. Not explosions, a low mechanical roar, followed by silence. Japanese troops began abandoning positions without orders, retreating deeper into the island, believing depth still offered safety. Instead, they concentrated themselves into fewer remaining habitable sections, accelerating the collapse when those areas were finally discovered. American intelligence unknowingly benefited from this behavior. Captured documents and maps found on fallen officers revealed tunnel layouts far more extensive than initially believed. Engineers used these materials to prioritize entrances connected to multiple chambers. One ignition could now affect dozens of rooms. By late February, flamethrower teams were averaging one bunker neutralization every 15 minutes in certain sectors. What had taken hours of infantry assault earlier in the battle now required minutes. The numbers reflect the shift. In the first 3 days of the invasion, American units suffered approximately 2,400 casualties while advancing less than 1,000 yards. In the following week, despite heavier resistance zones, casualty rates decreased as flamethrower usage increased. Japanese losses, meanwhile, accelerated dramatically, not through firefights, through disappearance. Entire platoons vanished between roll calls. Commanders stopped receiving casualty reports because no one was left alive to report. At the strategic level, Japanese high command had already accepted that Iwo Jima would fall. What they had not anticipated was how it would fall. The island was not being crushed, it was being hollowed out. American forces were not advancing across the surface, they were advancing through denial. Every sealed tunnel reduced the island's fighting capacity permanently. There was no regrouping, no rebuilding, no counterstroke. The underground defense network, once the pride of Japanese military engineering, became a liability that trapped its own defenders. A U.S. Marine Corps study conducted after the battle concluded that flamethrowers accounted for a disproportionately high percentage of enemy casualties relative to their numbers. Fewer than 3% of American personnel carried flamethrowers, yet they were responsible for neutralizing the majority of fortified positions. The weapon's effectiveness exceeded expectations, not because of lethality alone, but because of inevitability. Once a bunker was located, its fate was sealed. Japanese soldiers began to understand this in fragments. Some attempted to surrender. Many were killed attempting to exit smoke-filled tunnels into American lines. Others chose death inside, believing capture dishonorable or impossible. By February 26th, American units reported finding bunkers filled with bodies arranged deliberately, weapons stacked, ammunition unused. These were not combat casualties. They were decisions. The underground war had reached a point where resistance no longer served a tactical purpose. It became symbolic, endurance for its own sake. American commanders recognized the shift. Orders emphasized speed and containment over engagement. The objective was no longer to defeat Japanese forces, but to prevent them from emerging. Iwo Jima was being converted into a sealed battlefield. Above ground, flags would rise and fall. Below ground, the war had already ended. The Japanese defenders had believed the Americans could only fight in open space, beaches, hills, trenches. They had not imagined a weapon that turned enclosed space into a weapon itself. And by the time they fully understood what the flamethrower represented, the tunnels that once protected them had become their final position. March 1st, 1945, Iwo Jima, Central Command Tunnel beneath Mount Suribachi. By this stage of the battle, Japanese command no longer believed in victory. That illusion had died days earlier. What remained was endurance, honor, and calculation. The question was no longer whether the island could be held. It was how long resistance could be maintained before complete annihilation. Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, commander of Japanese forces on Iwo Jima, had designed the island's defenses with extraordinary care. Over 11 miles of tunnels connected bunkers, artillery positions, medical chambers, and command posts. Every yard of ground had been measured, reinforced, and concealed. Kuribayashi had explicitly rejected suicidal bonsai charges. His doctrine emphasized conservation of manpower, night movement, and attrition. His men were to fight underground, avoid artillery, and bleed the Americans slowly. On paper, it was flawless. In practice, the flamethrower broke the math. Japanese field reports from late February reveal a shift in language. Earlier entries discussed ammunition shortages and troop movements. By March, the dominant concern was oxygen. Entire sections of the tunnel system were marked as unusable, not destroyed, unusable. Temperatures inside some chambers were estimated to exceed 120 degrees Fahrenheit after repeated flame attacks. Smoke residue coated walls, ceilings, and lungs. Even when fires burned out, the air remained toxic. Medical officers reported that wounded soldiers could no longer be treated underground. Operating rooms were abandoned, bandages ignited from residual heat, morphine stocks were lost to fire. The tunnels stopped being a refuge. They became traps. Kuribayashi's headquarters itself was forced to relocate multiple times as flamethrower teams systematically collapsed access routes. Communications lines melted, field telephones failed. Runners never returned. By March 3rd, Japanese command structure on the island was fragmented beyond repair. American after-action reports reveal how deliberate the process had become. Flamethrower teams operated alongside demolition units, infantry, and tank support. Sherman tanks equipped with auxiliary flamethrowers delivered sustained bursts lasting up to 60 seconds, projecting fire over 150 feet. A single fuel tank could neutralize multiple bunker complexes. The numbers are stark. Across the Pacific Theater, flamethrowers accounted for fewer than 5% of American infantry weapons issued. On Iwo Jima, they were involved in the neutralization of over 80% of fortified Japanese positions. This imbalance did not go unnoticed. Captured Japanese documents recovered after the battle explicitly referenced American flame weapons as decisive. One report stated that tunnels were no longer defensible against sustained heat weapons. Another described the flamethrower as a weapon against the earth itself. Survivors later testified that fear of fire surpassed fear of artillery or bombing. Shells could be waited out, flames could not. Even Japanese soldiers conditioned to resist surrender began attempting escape at night, emerging from smoke-filled tunnels into American lines. Many were shot before they could speak. Others collapsed moments after exposure to fresh air. The battle was consuming itself from the inside. On March 8th, Kuribayashi transmitted what would become one of his final messages. He reported that organized resistance was no longer possible. Units were isolated, supplies were exhausted, communications had failed. He did not blame his men. He blamed the nature of the enemy. American forces, he acknowledged indirectly, had introduced a form of warfare that negated preparation, terrain, and sacrifice. The tunnels that had taken months to carve had been rendered obsolete in weeks. Above ground, American casualty figures remained high. Nearly 7,000 Marines would die on Iwo Jima. Over 19,000 were wounded. The cost was immense. But the Japanese losses were absolute. Of the approximately 21,000 defenders, fewer than 1,100 were captured alive. Most never emerged. Post-war analysis by the U.S. Marine Corps concluded that without flamethrowers, the battle would have required months longer and exponentially higher casualties. Traditional infantry assaults against fortified tunnels would have bled units dry. Instead, fire compressed time. It forced decisions. It ended resistance not through annihilation alone, but through inevitability. By the second week of March, flamethrowers were no longer just tactical tools. They were psychological weapons. The mere sound of ignition triggered abandonment of positions. Japanese soldiers who had prepared to fight to the last round now understood something unbearable. There was nowhere left to hide. The Americans had not simply adapted to underground warfare, they had ended it. March 26, 1945. Iwo Jima was officially declared secured. 36 days after the first Marines hit the black volcanic sand, the island stopped fighting. Not because every tunnel had been cleared, not because every defender had been found. It stopped because nothing meaningful remained underground. Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi was already dead. He had likely led a final night action days earlier, abandoning the doctrine that had defined his defense. His body was never conclusively identified. The tunnel system he had built still existed, but it was empty. American engineers mapped what remained after the battle, over 1,500 individual underground chambers, more than 11 miles of interconnected passages, command rooms, hospitals, artillery nests, food storage areas. Most were intact structurally. What killed them was not collapse. It was heat. Walls were blackened, steel reinforcements warped. Medical equipment fused into the rock. In many chambers, oxygen levels were measured so low that unprotected personnel could remain inside only minutes. The tunnels had survived bombardment. They did not survive fire. The U.S. Marine Corps conducted an extensive post-battle analysis. The conclusion was blunt. Traditional bunker reduction methods were insufficient against deep, interconnected defenses. Flamethrowers changed the equation. On Iwo Jima alone, fewer than 300 flamethrowers were deployed. That number represented a fraction of 1% of total American weapons on the island. Yet those teams were credited with neutralizing the majority of fortified positions. The math disturbed planners. If fire could erase months of preparation in weeks, then no underground defense was safe anymore. This lesson did not stay on Iwo Jima. It traveled. On Okinawa, flamethrower units were expanded and integrated at the platoon level. Tanks with flame projectors became standard assault assets. Infantry doctrine shifted toward systematic underground denial rather than surface clearance. Japanese defenders noticed. Intercepted communications from later battles show growing emphasis on dispersal, shallow positions, and rapid movement. The era of deep tunnel sanctuaries was ending. Fire had made permanence impossible. After the war, American officers reflected on the psychological effect more than the physical one. Explosives killed, artillery destroyed, but fire erased hope. It removed the idea of waiting. It turned time itself into a weapon. For the Japanese soldier underground, the realization came slowly, then all at once. The walls would not protect him. The earth would not shelter him. Endurance no longer mattered. The Americans did not need to find every tunnel. They only needed to make them unlivable. Today, visitors to Iwo Jima can still see collapsed entrances and blackened rock. The tunnels remain, but they are silent. No banners, no monuments underground, just scorched stone and narrow passages leading nowhere. The weapon that changed the battle is rarely celebrated. It does not sit proudly in museums like tanks or aircraft. Its legacy is uncomfortable, but its impact is undeniable. Japanese troops believed they were safe underground. They were wrong, because America did not bring a weapon to fight the bunker. It brought a weapon that ended the bunker itself.